Agriculture has never been simple. It's shaped by weather and markets, policy and politics, forces that often originate far from the farm gate. Headlines move fast, policies shift, markets react, but the impact of those changes doesn't just show up on screen, it shows up on farms and ranches, in families and rural communities. This podcast is about taking the time to explore what's happening in agriculture and what it means for the people living it, with clarity, context, and perspective. I'm Corryn La Rue, and this is Farm Unfiltered. The Supreme Court just redrew the lines on presidential trade power, and agriculture is once again caught in the middle. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down the sweeping global tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, ruling that the 1977 emergency statute doesn't give the president authority to unilaterally impose broad-based import taxes. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, says the Constitution, quote-unquote, very clearly grants Congress the authority to impose taxes, including tariffs. The opinion stated that the framers didn't vest any part of that taxing power in the executive branch. Justices Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas, and Brett Kavanaugh dissented. Kavanaugh argues that whether the tariffs were good policy or not, the statute's text and historical precedent made them lawful. What the court didn't address is just as important: whether businesses will receive refunds on the more than $133 billion collected under those emergency tariffs. That question is now headed back to lower courts, where companies have already began filing for reimbursement. For agriculture, this is not just a legal debate. It's another chapter in a long-running story about trade uncertainty. The ruling blocks tariffs under IEEPA, but it doesn't prevent the administration from using other authorities such as Section 232 or sector-specific statutes to impose duties. Administration officials have already signaled they intend to pursue alternative pathways. In a White House press conference, President Trump says that while he's disappointed in the court's ruling, he has several other avenues to enact trade-related tariffs.
The good news is that there are methods, practices, statutes, and authorities, as recognized by the entire court in this terrible decision, and also as recognized by Congress, which they refer to, that are even stronger than the IEEPA tariffs available to me as President of the United States. Those statutes include, for example, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, Section 232. All of these things I know so well. The Trade Act of 1974, Sections 122, 201, 301. And the Tariff Act of 1930, Section 338, all clear. But it's a little bit longer process. I thought I'd make things simple, but they didn't let us do that.
Let's take a moment to break down those other authorities. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 allows the president to impose tariffs or quotas on imports if the Department of Commerce determines they threaten U.S. national security. We've seen Trump use this avenue before, back in 2018, to impose steel and aluminum tariffs. So how this works: the Commerce Department conducts a national security investigation. If it finds a threat, the president can act without additional congressional approval. The action must be tied to national security, not general economic imbalance. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows the United States Trade Representative to impose tariffs in response to unfair trade practices by another country. This was the primary authority used for tariffs on China during the 2018 to 2020 trade dispute. How this works: USTR investigates unfair practices like intellectual property theft, subsidies, or forced tech transfer. If violations are found, tariffs can be imposed. There is a formal process with comment periods and review. Section 201 allows temporary tariffs or quotas if a surge in imports is causing serious injury to a U.S. industry. How this works is U.S. International Trade Commission investigates, and if injury is found, the president can impose temporary relief measures. Well, this is less common, but still available. Sector-specific statutes vary, but Congress has written targeted trade authorities into law for certain industries. Examples of this include anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, country-specific trade enforcement mechanisms, and agricultural-specific quota systems in certain agreements. These are narrower and require defined legal findings, but they're not affected by the IEEPA ruling. So what did the Supreme Court ruling actually change? IEEPA allowed tariffs tied to a declared national emergency. The court said that law doesn't grant tariff authority. So the president still has substantial tariff power, just not under emergency economic authority. In other words, the legal pathway changed, but the ability to impose duties didn't disappear. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to 2018. The steel and aluminum tariffs were imposed under Section 232, the national security authority that still remains intact today. Those tariffs weren't aimed at agriculture, but retaliation was. China responded with tariffs on U.S. soybeans. The EU targeted pork, Mexico hit cheese and other products. Canada targeted a range of U.S. goods. Agriculture became the pressure point. U.S. soybean exports to China fell sharply during the height of the trade dispute. Brazil filled the gap. Global trade flows shifted almost overnight, and some of those changes never fully reversed. The administration ultimately rolled out the Market Facilitation Program, more than $23 billion in direct payments across 2018 and 2019 to offset the damage from retaliatory tariffs. That is the backdrop for today's conversation. Because while the Supreme Court blocked tariffs under emergency authority, it didn't remove Section 232 or Section 301, the same legal tools that triggered retaliation 8 years ago. And farmers remember what that volatility felt like. Higher input costs, lost export markets, government payments filling gaps that trade once covered. Trade policy rarely moves in isolation. When tariffs go up, retaliation follows. And historically, agriculture has often been the first target. What we learned in 2018 is that once market share shifts, it's difficult to win back. Brazil expanded soybean infrastructure during the U.S.-China trade dispute. Buyers adjusted supply chains. Even after Phase 1 agreements were signed, trade flows never fully returned to pre-dispute patterns. That's why the legal authority behind tariff matters, not just politically, but structurally for long-term competitiveness. Trade advocacy groups reacted quickly to the Supreme Court's decision. Farmers for Free Trade welcomed the ruling, arguing that tariffs imposed under IEEPA drove up costs for inputs like fertilizer, equipment, and parts, while triggering retaliatory tariffs that reduced export access. The group urged policymakers not to simply replace one tariff authority with another, warning that retaliation would likely follow. The International Fresh Produce Association also supported the court's clarification, stating that broad country-specific tariffs disrupt seasonally sensitive supply chains and raise consumer costs. The group emphasized that tariffs shouldn't become a default policy response and called instead for lower trade barriers and long-term trade agreements. Congressman Adrian Smith of Nebraska, chairman of the House Ways and Means Subcommittee on Trade, emphasized that Congress must play a central role moving forward. He says only comprehensive and enforceable trade agreements can provide lasting certainty beyond any single administration. So where does this leave agriculture? In a familiar place, waiting for clarity. As Congress works through remaining Farm Bill provisions and the administration evaluates next trade steps, two themes dominate heading into 2026: regulatory certainty and reliable market access. Farmers don't just need strong prices, they need predictable policy. And right now, both are still very much in motion. That's it for today. As always, the goal here is to better understand what's happening in agriculture and what it means beyond the headlines. I'm Corryn La Rue, and this is Farm Unfiltered.